Welcome, everyone. My name is Mark Creswick. I'm the Senior Policy Director here at the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. Delighted to be here to introduce all of you and share with you the results of our 2023 Utility Energy Efficiency Scorecard. The American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy is a nonprofit research organization that develops transformative policies to reduce energy waste and combat climate change. With our independent analysis, we aim to build a vibrant and equitable economy, one that uses energy more productively, reduces costs, protects the environment, and promotes the health and safety and well-being of everyone. Of course, our utilities across the country deliver a huge amount of energy efficiency services to customers in their service territories. Nearly $8 billion of energy efficiency investment was made by utilities in 2021. ACEEE, every 3 years, evaluates those impacts, those programs, through our Utility Energy Efficiency Scorecard. So we're delighted to share those results with you today. I'm joined by 3 wonderful panelists: Mike Spiecian, the lead author of the report, who will be taking us through those results; Chelsea Harnish, with the Virginia Energy Efficiency Coalition, who will be speaking to some of the impacts in Virginia of the utility efficiency programs there; and Dr. Sonia Carley, who will be sharing some of the energy burden aspects and energy justice aspects of the utility efficiency programs. Before we start, I want to thank the generous donors who made this work possible, including JPB Foundation, Tilia Fund, and Barr Foundation, as well as all of the utilities who run these programs, respond to the data requests, and deliver these impressive results. And of course, all of the ACEEE staff, as well as all of the and external reviewers who made this great report possible. With that, we will turn it over to Mike. Just before we do that, a few logistics. We are, of course, recording this. There is a Q&A function at any point. Feel free to ask questions using the box at the bottom of your screen. We will try to answer those questions at the end of these presentations, as well as live while the webinar is ongoing. Without any further ado, Mike Spiecian, again, is a research manager with the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy's Utilities Program. His research focuses on the role of energy efficiency within the evolving energy landscape, including policies and practices to maximize energy efficiency's potential to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to a changing climate. Prior to joining ACEEE, Mike worked as an assistant research scientist at the Institute for Data Intensive Engineering and Science and at the U.S. Department of Energy, where he facilitated behind-the-meter innovations to make buildings more energy efficient, resilient, and flexible for the evolving electricity grid. Mike holds a PhD in physics from Johns Hopkins University. Mike, take it away.
All right, thank you, Mark. And of course, thank you to everyone else who's joining us here today. In 2021, as Mark mentioned, utilities invested more than $7.6 billion in energy efficiency in the form of things like incentives, rebates, and services. Utilities have enormous customer bases and the ability to scale solutions. And as a result, the utility sector is perhaps the best positioned of any sector to deliver energy savings to Americans. And that's why I am so excited that the 2023 Utility Energy Efficiency Scorecard is being released today, because we can now share with all of you how well utilities have been able to do just that. And as the title of this slide indicates, this report evaluates and ranks the largest U.S. electric utilities on their policy and program efforts related to energy efficiency. And in this report, which is the 3rd triennial edition of Utility Scorecard, we evaluated 53 utilities that serve approximately 79 million residential customers, representing about 60% of all U.S. households. These utilities operate across 31 different state and regulatory environments. And these are environments that strongly influence planning, administration, and implementation of energy efficiency programs. As a result, the evaluation that we are about to share reflects the totality of actions and conditions that allow energy efficiency to flourish in a service territory, including those actions that result from legislative or regulatory processes that may or may not reside within a utility's sphere of influence. Consequently, The scores and rankings that utilities earn on this utility scorecard reflect not only the utilities themselves, but also the legislative and regulatory environments within which they operate. This is also the reason why we choose to focus on state jurisdictional utilities rather than their parent companies, which can operate multiple utilities across multiple states. So now that we've discussed who we are evaluating, let me share why we do it. The goals of this utility scorecard are to evaluate and quantify electric utilities' energy efficiency accomplishments, to spotlight exemplary policies, programs, and activities that can serve as models for efficiency-oriented utilities, to rank and compare utilities to foster accountability and constructive competition, and to drive ambitious, equitable, clean energy actions. We evaluated these utilities across 27 dimensions, or what we call action categories, and we quantify their achievements using a scoring system that allocates up to 100 points across 3 groups. A performance group that includes elements like how much utilities spend and save, a programs group that looks at what utilities offer their customers, and an enabling group, which covers all the enabling policies, etc., that help energy efficiency to flourish. And the number of points associated with each of the 27 action categories is scaled to represent our assessment of each's relative importance in the utility energy efficiency ecosystem. So let me give you a rundown of the action categories that we used in this edition to evaluate utility energy efficiency program performance. Utilities could earn up to 16 points for their net incremental electricity savings. In other words, these are the energy savings achieved in the year 2021, where we draw all of our data from, or most of our data, that are directly attributable to utility efficiency programs installed in that year. Utilities could earn up to 11 points based on the percentage of their annual revenue they invested in efficiency programs. Up to 7 points could be earned based on the percentage of peak demand reduced by efficiency measures. Up to 7 points for the total anticipated lifetime energy savings of measures installed in 2021. Then we have our first 2 energy equity related categories. First, how much did the utility spend on low income energy efficiency programs in 2021? And how much did those programs save? And we also award a couple points based on how well the utility achieved its energy savings targets. Next, utilities could earn up to 20 points based on the number and diversity of efficiency programs they offer. This table summarizes the categories and how many different program types a utility needs to offer to earn maximum points, which you can see on the right. And a full listing of what qualifies as a residential program, a commercial industrial program, emerging programs, low-income programs, and EV programs is available within the report itself. Our largest set of action categories falls within what we call our enabling group, and it's collectively worth up to 26 points. Here, utilities can earn points for having a strong utility business model that removes the incentive for high volume electricity sales, compensates utilities for lost revenue due to efficiency, and incentivizes the utility to hit savings targets. Utilities can earn points for ensuring that energy efficiency is accounted for during the resource planning process, for having energy savings targets in place, for providing customers access to their energy consumption data, for having their efficiency programs independently evaluated, for keeping monthly fixed charges on customer bills low, and for offering time of use rates for residential customers. In this edition of Utility Scorecard, the most significant change that we made was our increased emphasis on energy equity. So a couple of years ago, ACEEE launched the Leading with Equity initiative, which was committed in part to embedding more equity considerations into the definition of a successful utility. We collaborated regularly with community-based organizations and energy equity advocates to ensure that their perspectives and priorities were integrated into this report. And one result of that engagement was the introduction of 6 new equity-related action categories. They are community engagement, which assesses whether utilities solicited input from the historically under-resourced communities that low-income efficiency programs are designed to serve. Energy affordability, which looks at utility efforts to reduce energy burden for customers spending a disproportionately large share of their income on energy costs. Financing, which assesses how well utilities facilitate solutions to help customers pay for efficiency upgrades. Language access, which assesses the action utilities have taken to remove language-based barriers to efficiency program participation. Workforce development, which looks at a variety of actions utilities can take to strengthen, bolster, diversify the efficiency workforce. And utility shutoff, which looks at whether utilities direct customers at risk of utility disconnection for non-payment towards efficiency programs that will lower their bills month over month. The second change we made to our action categories was the addition of 2 new categories to capture early progress in decarbonizing our energy system through energy efficiency. The first awards utilities for tracking energy savings that result from switching from fossil-based appliances to electric appliances, or in other words, their electrification savings. And the second, which is unscored, looks at whether utilities have established explicit greenhouse gas reduction goals for their efficiency programs. And without further ado, here are some results. This slide contains a scoring breakdown of our 10 highest scoring utilities on the left and our 10 lowest scoring utilities on the right. You will notice that the top 10 performers are spread across 7 states, including 2 utilities from Massachusetts, 2 from Michigan, and 3 from California. Congratulations go out to Eversource Massachusetts, who earned 85% of the available points and the top spot in our ranking for the 3rd consecutive edition. In contrast, among our bottom 10 utilities are 4 from the Midwest, 3 from the Southeast, and 2 from Texas. I want to point out that, for context, in 2018 and 2019, Iowa and Ohio, respectively, passed laws that greatly limited energy efficiency in those states. And so utilities in those states, that would be Mid-American Energy Iowa, AEP Ohio, Duke Ohio, and Ohio Edison, have seen major drops in their utility scorecard rankings as a result. And this just demonstrates how important supportive legislative and regulatory environments actually are. And as you take a look at the full set of utility rankings by geography, I want to just mention a utility efficiency success story. If we go back 15 years, Michigan utilities were providing no efficiency services to their customers. And then in 2008, Michigan passed a law requiring its electric utilities to establish efficiency programs and to achieve energy savings targets. The Michigan utilities not only hit those targets, but exceeded them year over year, such that we are now in a situation where Consumers Energy and DTE are 2 of the top performing utilities in the country when it comes to energy efficiency. So from 0 to hero, this absolutely is a journey that can be done, and these 2 utilities have proven it. And another state where we've seen a big positive change is in Virginia. So in 2020, Virginia established an energy efficiency resource standard, which required Dominion, Virginia, to achieve 5% energy savings through their efficiency programs by 2025, among some other provisions. And as a result, in this edition of Utility Scorecard, Dominion, Virginia is our most improved utility, rising from number 50 3 years ago to number 27 today. Now, I will say Dominion still has a long way to go, especially when it comes to program performance, and the key players in Virginia will need to stay committed to this trajectory, which is at risk right now. And in just a few minutes, Chelsea Harnish, who's been in the trenches in Virginia, will share more details about the really important developments happening down there. And before wrapping up, I'd like to share just a few more key takeaways from Utility Scorecard, and I'll start with some spending and savings trends. 3 years ago, we reported that utilities on average were spending 2.5% of their revenue on efficiency programs. 3 years later, unfortunately, spending has dropped in absolute terms 4.9% to an average of 2.23%. And as you might expect, this has negatively impacted savings as well. In 2018, utilities were saving an average of 1.03% of their annual sales through efficiency. 3 years later, overall savings in absolute terms have dropped 5.4% to an average of 0.91%. Likewise, energy efficiency went from shaving about 0.8% off peak demand to 0.7%. And I would characterize all these trends as moving in the wrong direction. And even if we were to remove from consideration the 3 Ohio utilities that had their efficiency programs canceled, efficiency spending is still down over 2% nationally on average, and efficiency savings are about the same as they were 3 years ago. We do see some positive developments on low-income programs, however, as utilities have increased low-income spending 17% since the last edition, going from 10.7% of their efficiency program budgets on average to 12.8%. This has translated to an increase in low-income savings per residential customer of 9.5%. So this is certainly a trend in the right direction, but those spending and savings levels, we would argue, are still too low. So in principle, if X% of a utility's customers are low income, then they should receive at least X% of the efficiency program benefits. But we know that low income programs typically require more spending per customer to achieve the same benefit. And about 12% of Americans are below the federal poverty line. The percentage of low-income Americans who qualify or who are defined as such by many utility efficiency programs is actually higher than that 12%. So if you combine all these things together, we know that the average level of low-income spending, while an improvement, is almost certainly still too low from an equity perspective. And the final key takeaway I'll share has to do with greenhouse gas reductions. So while many states, and in fact 28 of our 53 evaluated utilities, have established some form of carbon reduction targets, those targets have yet to work their way into efficiency programs for the vast majority of utilities we evaluated. In fact, only 2, National Grid Massachusetts and Eversource Massachusetts, have explicitly incorporated GHG reduction goals into their energy efficiency programs. In fairness to a state like New York, there are other ways to assess the decarbonization benefits of efficiency programs, but even still, only about 10% of utilities we evaluated are even tracking the savings achieved through electrification initiatives, and data tracking is a relatively simple first step towards larger decarbonization initiatives. All right, I'll stop here, but I do want to mention that Utility Scorecard has a lot more content than what I'm sharing here right now. So if you'd like to see how your favorite utility performed across these 27 action categories, please go ahead and download the report. It's available right now on our website. You'll be able to read our descriptions of utility best practices, see our scoring metrics and more granular data, see examples of exemplary program models, and access something like 40 pages of references. And if you have any questions or you'd like to discuss this more offline, please feel free to contact me. Here's my contact information. And with that, I'll hand it back to Mark.
Thank you so much, Mike. And thank you everyone who is weighing in the chat. Definitely recommend sending any questions using the Q&A function rather than the chat function. That'll allow us to track those questions better. And if we're not able to get to them right now, we'll be able to respond offline after the end of the webinar. Up next, as Mike alluded to, we will hear from Chelsea Harnish. Chelsea is the Executive Director of the Virginia Energy Efficiency Council, where she oversees all operations and strategic initiatives, including programs, policy, communications, membership, and events. With over a decade of Virginia energy policy experience, Chelsea regularly engages with decision makers, partners, and members to advance energy efficiency policies and programs that will help grow the industry throughout the Commonwealth. Prior to joining the Virginia Energy Efficiency Council, Chelsea worked for several environmental nonprofits, honing her skills in campaign planning, communication, and advocating for clean energy policy initiatives. Chelsea, please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Mike, and all of the ACEEE team for putting together this report and putting on this webinar and inviting me. I appreciate it. As they mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of the Virginia Energy Efficiency Council. We are a broad-based coalition of entities in Virginia who work to advance energy efficiency here in the state. We work with our members to identify barriers and opportunities for energy efficiency advancement throughout the Commonwealth. Some of our focus areas obviously are on advancing effective utility energy efficiency programs, but we also work to support the weatherization and other low-income initiatives here in the state. We work to advance energy efficiency in the statewide building code and provide support and resources to our state and local governments. So why Virginia? As Mike mentioned in the report, Dominion Virginia, our largest investor-owned utility in the state, was named the most improved utility. They went from 50th place in 2020 all the way to 27th place. Before we jump into the why, I just wanted to quickly take a walk back in time to the Virginia utility regulatory timeline. Like most southeastern states, Virginia utilities are regulated monopolies, except for a brief moment in time for about an 8-year period in the 90s and early 2000s, where they became deregulated. They were re-regulated in 2007. And in 2009, the process was established to determine cost effectiveness that could be decided at the State Corporation Commission, which is our public utility commission. The energy efficiency policy was not touched again for nearly a decade until the Grid Transformation and Security Act of 2018, and then with the Virginia Clean Economy Act in 2020, which Mike has already mentioned. So the Grid Transformation and Security Act of 2018, its biggest goal was to allow our two investor-owned utilities, Dominion Energy and Appalachian Power Company, to invest excess profits into renewable generation and grid modernization updates. In addition to that, advocates really pushed for these two IOUs to spend more money on energy efficiency programs. The IOUs committed to proposing over $1 billion combined in energy efficiency investments through 2028. It also increased shareholder investments in Dominion Energy's low-income energy efficiency program, which is called Energy Share, to $13 million all the way through 2028. And it was also a way for us advocates to establish a stakeholder process to provide feedback on each of the utilities' energy efficiency portfolio. We wanted to model this after the Arkansas stakeholder group, the People Working Collaborative Initiative, where all of the utilities come to the table with all of the stakeholders. Instead, we have two separate stakeholder processes for the two investor-owned utilities, and that has been in place again since 2018. Quickly, I wanted to just mention the reason that this language says they committed to proposing is because historically, when in 2009, when the rules around cost effectiveness were set in place, our State Corporation Commission relied heavily on the RIM test, the ratepayer impact test. And as many of you probably know, that is really not the best test to measure cost effectiveness or really the efficacy or efficiency of an energy efficiency program. With the Grid Transformation Security Act, we wanted to remove that barrier to see more energy efficiency programs being approved. And so with this law, the language was changed to say that any energy efficiency program that passed 3 of 4 cost benefit tests was in the public interest, meaning it must be approved by the SCC. For the Virginia Clean Economy Act, 2 years later, the overall statute, the purpose of it was to require Virginia's two investor-owned utilities to be carbon-free by 2050. This law also established a mandatory renewable portfolio standard as well as an energy efficiency resource standard. It also prioritizes energy efficiency over new fossil fuel generation by stating that the utilities cannot build any new fossil fuel generation unless their energy efficiency goals have been met. It also protects low-income ratepayers from the higher cost of the clean energy transition, particularly as it relates to offshore wind. Mike already mentioned the Dominion Energy goals. So it's 5% by 2025. For Appalachian Power Company, it's 2% by 2025. These two investor-owned utilities in their territories in Virginia are vastly different. They are almost like night and day. So with that, they have two different, they are actually generally treated differently in statute. The ERS is based on 2019 electric retail sales and is calculated as total annual. That means that we're only looking at all savings from all measures that are still calculating, that have estimated savings in a single given year. So it is not cumulative. Beyond 2025, the State Corporation Commission, or the SCC, will set the goals in 3-year increments. So where are we? What is the progress 3 years later? Obviously, as Mike mentioned, this Virginia Clean Economy Act and the Grid Transformation Security Act have really helped propel Dominion into the middle of the pack, where they started at the very bottom and really have become the most improved because of these policies that have been passed. In addition, some other progress that's happened is that the State Corporation Commission is approving energy efficiency programs. Dominion has also developed a long-term plan that was proposed in December of 2021 to identify their pathway or their roadmap on how they're going to meet their energy efficiency goals. APCO is currently meeting all of its targets, and Dominion has met its 2022 target. These are both unverified because the first compliance hearing will not take place until next year. The SCC is also putting greater responsibility and expecting greater efficacy from the energy efficiency stakeholder process. And additionally, utility low-income programs utilize the weatherization network. That is one thing we do really well here in Virginia, is that all low-income energy efficiency programs are provided for by the weatherization network, whether it's the federal weatherization program, whether it's any utility program, whether it could be gas or electric, and also our participation in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI. 50% of those dollars go to low-income energy efficiency programming, and the weatherization providers also use that funding. That really helps them braid funding and identify what is the best funding source or funding sources for that individual home. It's almost like a customized program where they can identify what is the best way to maximize savings for that individual customer. However, there do remain challenges 3 years later. For the 2023 to 2025 goals, Dominion will not be meeting them. You may notice that my slide previously said they were only meeting the 2022 goal. There's controversy in how the goals should be defined, and I won't get into those details, but they're looking at whether it's net or gross. And for 2023, they would be met one way, but not the other. For 2024 and 2025, those goals would not be met either way. The question is why, and what are some of the reasons for that? Well, as I mentioned, Dominion does have a long-term plan, but the implementation of it has been slow. As I mentioned, it was put out in December of 2021. There has been some progress made, but I think advocates would like to have seen a faster ramp up. Also, Dominion's projected versus actual program savings are not aligned. In their latest EM&V report, which came out in the spring, the SCC staff did analysis of that data. And in 2021, the residential programs only met 45% of the participation goal and only 57% of their estimated savings goals. For the non-residential programs, they only met 43% of the participation goal and 32% of the estimated savings goal. The SCC staff also identified that for Dominion to meet its 2024 EERS goal, it has, for it to meet the 2025 goal, there is 1,180 gigawatt hours of a gap. That's a pretty extensive gap. So that's sort of the issue that we're seeing now. For 2026 and beyond, the goals are not prescribed in legislation. One of the most concerning reasons for that, or concerning issues with that really, is that right now we only have one commissioner on our commission. We typically have a three commissioners on our commission, but they are elected by the General Assembly, and we are in an election year, and those two appointments have been caught up in political back and forth. So they have not been seated for over a year. And we hope that they will be seated when the General Assembly reconvenes in January, but we don't know for sure. Also, Dominion has proposed building 7 new natural gas plants in its latest IRP, which was they applied for earlier this year. Again, the VCA says that they cannot put out or apply for new natural gas or any other fossil fuel plants unless they're meeting their energy efficiency goals. There is one caveat to that unless there's a concern with reliability. So the question is the company proposing these new natural gas plants and they're going to pose it as a reliability issue, or are they going to make every attempt they can to pass the 2024 and 2025 goals? We'll just have to wait and see. However, all is not lost because there are opportunities. They do still have the opportunity to meet those goals. There are low-hanging fruit solutions as outlined in their long-term plan. Right now, they are undergoing rebranding. Actually, their energy efficiency programs have never had branding. So they are looking at branding them, which is what most other utilities have done across the country. They also have surveyed in the long-term plan, there were surveys put out to identify what are the customer awareness numbers, and they're pretty low. So lower than some of their peer utilities. So that's low-hanging fruit, that if they focus on participation and awareness of their programs and branding and other marketing, they can continue to bring those numbers up. Increased participation means increased energy savings, which just continues to grow and help them meet those goals. The other issue is with reevaluating the cost effectiveness tests. As I mentioned, in 2018, we were trying to solve one issue, the over-reliance on the RIM test, but now we've created another one. We are the only state in the country where the regulatory process relies on 3 of 4 tests. As many of you know, most states only have one test. There's only one cost effectiveness test. So advocates and the utilities alike and state corporation commission staff have been in conversations to identify what that one test could look like. Which is important that it would align with our climate and policy goals, much like using the principles that the National Standard Practice Manual puts forward. Additionally, I think as with every other utility across the country, braiding the BIL and IRA funds will be critical. This is something that we've been talking a lot with the utilities and our state energy office about, in that ensuring that if a customer has gone and is gone to a contractor and is interested in the federal rebates, that they're aware of the utility programs that are available to them, and vice versa. If they have gone to the Dominion site and maybe they've signed up for a home energy assessment, that contractor while in their home is also making sure that they are aware of the federal funding. That's going to take a lot of behind the scenes effort and a lot of education, but we've been in talks with the utilities and with our state energy office, and everyone is in agreement that is necessary to move forward. Additionally, with lessons learned from all of this, policy absolutely drives progress. We would not have jumped, Dominion and Virginia would not have jumped from 50th to 27th in this scorecard if it had not been for the Clean Economy Act. That has absolutely been a driver for the success we've seen in the state. It's also important that you're using data-driven goal setting. You don't want to just arbitrarily set a number or a goal that doesn't make sense. And thankfully, I want to give a shout out to ACEEE's utility program team who really helped us back in 2020 identify what would be the most appropriate goals for the utilities in Virginia. It's also important that you align cost benefit tests with policy goals. Again, much like as is outlined in the National Standard Practice Manual. And diverse stakeholder engagement is key. A lot of the advancement that we've seen has been driven by stakeholders and will continue to be driven by stakeholders. In the latest final report final order from the State Corporation Commission, they require the company to work out some of the issues with the stakeholders, and not only just work it out, but also then report back to the commission on how those conversations are going. So this is the first time that they have ever required that, and it just goes to show that they're starting to realize the potential and the responsibility that the stakeholder group should have. And finally, as I have already mentioned, utilizing the weatherization network for low-income programs, we do that really well, and would love to see other states follow suit. So, Mike said that Virginia is at risk. I like to think of it as we are at a crossroads. We can either go one way and continue to climb to the top of the ACEEE scorecard, or unfortunately, we could fall to the bottom of the ACEEE scorecard. Either option is still viable. I think it's just going to take a lot of work and collaboration among stakeholders and among the utilities to make it happen. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. And to everyone, please keep those the Q&A questions coming. Please put them in the Q&A function. We're answering them live as they come in, and we will hopefully be able to speak to some verbally as well. Our last panelist is Dr. Sonia Carley, who is Presidential Distinguished Professor of Energy Policy and City Planning at the Stuart Weitzman School of Design and Faculty Co-Director of the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy at the University of Pennsylvania. She holds secondary appointments at the Wharton School and the School of Social Policy and Practice. She also co-directs the Energy Justice Lab. Dr. Carley's research focuses on energy justice and just transitions, energy insecurity, electricity and transportation markets, and public perceptions of energy infrastructure and technologies. With the Energy Justice Lab team, she built and maintains the Utility Disconnection Dashboard. She's an author of the 5th National Climate Assessment Report and a member of the Innovation Policy Forum and the Roundtable on Macroeconomics and Climate-Related Risks and Opportunities, respectively, for the National Academies. Dr. Carley received her PhD in public policy from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, her master's in urban and regional planning from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and bachelor's degrees in economics and sustainable development from Swarthmore College. Dr. Carley, please take it away.
Will do. Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me today. It's a distinct pleasure to be here with Mike and Mark and Chelsea and the ACEEE team and all attendees. So I was asked today to think deeply about the equity metrics and to provide commentary on this scorecard. And in doing so, I'd like to first present a little bit of background as to why I think energy efficiency is so important from an equity perspective, and specifically from a perspective of energy burdens and energy poverty. So here I'm going to start through the framework of energy justice. And this framework asks fundamental questions that align with topics of distributive justice, procedural justice, and recognition justice. These include questions such as what's the distribution of benefits and burdens of our energy systems, who has access to the benefits, who does not, who has access to clean, affordable, reliable, sustainable energy, and who does not. It includes questions about who is allowed to participate in decision-making processes, who has a voice and who is allowed to lead. And it also includes fundamental questions about who are the energy haves and the have-nots of both our current energy systems, our future energy systems, and fundamentally our historic energy systems. So here with this as a framework, allow me to present a really important, I would argue, dimension of energy equity, and that is thinking about energy burden and energy poverty within the United States. Now here I've presented a graph, actually that's been produced by ACEEE, who's done phenomenal work within this space of tracking energy burden, which is the percentage of one's income that they spend on energy. And what you can see in this graph is that the average American spends about 3% of their income on energy, but for certain social demographic groups, as well as with certain regions of the country, which is not shown in this map, these burdens are much higher, including particularly for low-income households, as well as households of color. Now, I argue in my work that the energy burden measure is very important. It's a metric that is quite useful in targeting funds and investment and other support mechanisms. But the energy burden measure is incomplete in fully directing energy efficiency efforts as well as a variety of efforts. Energy burden does not necessarily account for those who do not have air conditioning or heating units, for example. Or those who might have to very heavily ration their air conditioning and heating in order to save money on their energy bills or in order to avoid being disconnected from their service providers. It doesn't include those who are actually disconnected, and it doesn't include those who might use very dangerous strategies, financial strategies, behavioral strategies in order to avoid high bills and being disconnected. And so here I'll push us, and in my research, I try to push our collective community in thinking more deeply about these issues and thinking about other metrics that we can use. In some of our work, we've adopted ideas from the energy insecurity and poverty literature, where we can classify households that are unable to provide sufficient resources, energy resources for their family, as one with three different metrics, actually. One, struggling to pay an energy bill; two, receiving a notice for disconnection; and three, being disconnected from one service provider. And in research that we've conducted, we actually find that this is not a linear process, that this is actually, for many households that struggle with energy insecurity, a cyclical process where they start by struggling to pay their energy bill. They may eventually end up in the form of disconnection. And once a household is disconnected, it is very difficult to break this cycle, to regain, to land on their feet, and to avoid being disconnected again in the future. Now, as Mike mentioned, I've helped build the utility disconnection dashboard. This is utilitydisconnections.org. And if you go here, you can essentially play around and look through data of disconnections as well as disconnection protections that exist across the states. And just to highlight one very real statistic that came out of this past year's data, for 332 reporting utilities that we were able to find, there were almost 3 million disconnections in the past year. And again, you can go to this website and see where these disconnections are in greater hotspots. And we know from a very vast body of literature that without energy, one can't charge their devices, their phones, their computers, their laptops. They can't run their refrigerator, therefore they can't keep perishable and healthy food. They can't run electronic medical devices that they might rely on for life or death, and they might not be able to keep their bodies warm or cool, which can lead to a variety of mental and adverse health, physical health outcomes, including in some cases, not rare at all cases, it can lead to death. In our research, our survey research of those within 200% of the federal poverty line, we've assessed through empirical work what factors correlate with energy insecurity. And we find that one of the leading indicators is that a house is inefficient. It has inefficient housing conditions or exposed housing conditions. This might mean gaps in the wall, for example, windows that don't fully close, broken HVAC systems, broken refrigerators, mold, and a variety of other conditions. We also find that certain households are more prone to being disconnected and struggling to pay their bills, including those that have an individual who relies on an electronic medical device, as well as households that are particularly low income, that have children under the age of 5, and households of color. Now, just to show a few of the basic descriptive statistics from this work, here you can see these same 3 metrics of not being able to pay your bill, receiving a notice, and disconnection. And we've mapped it by households and their racial profiles. And you can see here that, for example, the difference between a white household and a Black household is about double in terms of not being able to pay their bill, but it's about triple, 3 times the rate are Black households disconnected above white households. And for Hispanic households, this is 4 times the rate of disconnection than white households. Now, we see similar disparities with households with young children, which is particularly concerning for many reasons. If children are disturbed within the home, if they might not be able to live within the home because it's disconnected, here we can see that rates are 3 times higher for households with young children. Now, we've also looked at coping strategies and what households do when they're struggling to pay their energy bill. And I've highlighted here the difference between dark blue and light blue. This is the frequency of all low-income households. So this is a representative sample of low-income households, that the most common techniques for dealing with difficulty of paying one's energy bill are also the riskiest techniques. So 27% of all low-income households accrue debt. 26% use some kind of risky temperature behavior, including burning trash in your home, opening your oven, for example, flaring your stovetop, sitting in your car and running your car for heat while it's in a garage. Balancing bills is 18% of the sample. Forgoing expenses on food is 17%. And you can see some of the least common techniques that households engage in, including picking up the phone and calling the utility for assistance when they're struggling to pay their energy bill, which is only 6% of all low-income households. and 11% who seek out government assistance, government support, such as through the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program. Now, the fundamental question here today is, how can energy efficiency help? And I would argue that it can help in a variety of ways. It can reduce your energy bills. It can make energy more affordable, and it can then therefore enable households to use less or to use more in the case that they need to use more in order for their thermal comfort. It can help reduce energy insecurity and poverty, and it can help households avoid entering this cycle of energy insecurity. And in fact, if you allow me just to go back to the linear projection of this concept, I would argue these are all solutions that are in the gray rectangles at the bottom, that energy efficiency and weatherization actually is fundamental at every stage of this energy insecurity cycle, where it can help as a preventative solution, help households avoid becoming trapped in that cycle. But it can also help much later on. For example, when a household has received a notice for disconnection, they can have energy efficiency assistance and therefore hopefully avoid being disconnected. Now, let me turn then to some reflections on the scorecard in light of some of these ideas, thinking about the metrics that are here and thinking about how these households might be able to engage in energy efficiency programs. First, I'd just like to highlight equity is 22% of the metrics within the scorecard, and I think that that is tremendous. I think that that shows, it really highlights how important these issues are in present day. Two, I'd like to challenge us to think a little bit about how well we can overcome the energy efficiency gap. So we know that there's an energy efficiency gap for all households within the United States as well as across the world, but that gap is particularly pronounced, particularly for low-income households as well as other more disadvantaged households. And so here, in order to overcome this gap, it's really important, one, to reduce the barriers to energy efficiency, recognizing that some of these barriers may be more pronounced for low-income customers. For example, one might not own the residence that they live in. They might rent it. Two, it's important to provide information about access to these opportunities, because many of these opportunities are frankly not on one's radar. They might not know that they exist. And three, it's important to build trust and engagement within the communities and households. Now, here's a list of 7 of the equity metrics that are included in this year's scorecard. There's more, but these are 7 ones that I think are really important. And in fact, if we take the 3 objectives and we take these 7 metrics, I just mapped them directly, and we can see that reducing barriers is captured in 3 of the metrics at least. We can interpret these even more broadly, and I think map them to even more. Information provision is also in 3 of them, and building trust and engagement is in 3. So here, just I'd like to give kudos to the ACEEE for really targeting such effective metrics and thinking through the complexities of this challenge, particularly for low-income households. Going forward for utilities, as well as perhaps for these metrics, I think it's important for us to think deeply about what we're documenting, and that it's not enough to simply document how much money goes towards households that are struggling, but also to think deeply about the real benefits that they might achieve as a result of these targeted interventions. So these benefits might include things such as enhanced thermal comfort, which might actually mean a higher energy burden, but they're feeling more comfortable in their home. It might also mean fewer disconnections. So here is a challenge to the broader community of thinking deeply about these metrics and moving beyond just the energy burden metrics to think about other forms of energy poverty and other benefits that might accrue to these households. Another thing that I noticed in thinking through these scorecard metrics is that only 13 of the 53 utilities actually direct their customers who are at risk of shutoffs towards energy efficiency programs. And if we think about the importance, again, of energy efficiency through that full cycle of energy and security, I'm hopeful that at least some of you will agree with me that it's important for a greater number of utilities to direct their customers in this direction. This is only 25%, or 1 of 4 of the utilities in the sample. Now, I also note from the utility disconnection dashboard that some of the same utilities that have the highest rates of disconnection are the ones who are not directing their customers towards energy efficiency. Now, this raises questions, I think. Does this mean that energy efficiency programs are too late to help, or too little, too late? I think that the data don't reveal answers to these questions, but we should, of course, ask them. And I think it's important for utilities to think about whether their customers trust them when they are providing energy efficiency services, and think deeply about how to build trust with their customers going forward. Now, here are just a few other complementary utility efforts that one could consider. I don't think that these are directly energy efficiencies, so I think it's perfectly logical that they were not included in this scorecard. But for all of the utilities that are out there and thinking about the programs that they offer, I think this is part of kind of a more comprehensive suite or package, including PIP programs and AMP programs, debt forgiveness, essentially, and helping people pay down their energy bills. So with that, I'll go ahead and stop sharing, and I look forward to the rest of our conversation here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carly, both for your work and for participating in this webinar. Thank you as well to Chelsea and Mike for the wonderful panel. We'll move at this point to Q&A. As I said, we have been answering many of those questions during this discussion, but we have a few more open that we'll continue to answer. And I want to start with one to Mike that combines a few of these. A number of questions have come in about the dynamics behind, for instance, the divergence in Michigan and Ohio, also the decline in performance by BGE in Maryland. Can you speak a little bit to the dynamics, including state legislative trends and regulatory trends that lead to these results, and speak specifically to Maryland if you're able?
Yeah, so it's an example of legislation taking the states in two different directions. As I mentioned, prior to 2008, there were no legally mandated targets for energy efficiency providers, utility programs to offer savings and hit savings targets in the state. Once those savings targets were put in place and the utilities were required to hit those targets, they not only hit them but exceeded them, and they kept, the targets would be strengthened, they'd exceed them again, and a process has occurred that over time the growth in those savings has just continued to amass in the state of Michigan. Exactly the opposite thing happened in Ohio. Some of you may have heard of HB 6. Got a lot of news in 2019. It was a law that passed through corruption. People have been charged and convicted, I think are going to jail for it, including the Speaker of the House there. And payoffs were made, and part of the collateral damage there was energy efficiency programs in that state ended up getting canceled. So Ohio basically lost out on, I didn't mention this explicitly, but in the last edition, a lot of the Ohio utilities were, I think, in the top 10s and into the 20s. So they were doing fairly well nationally, above average. And the canceling of the programs had just caused them to plummet. You mentioned BG&E. I did see that there was a question about, can you compare how a utility did 3 years ago to this year? Why is there a drop or why is there an increase? I will say in general that we try to keep the methodology as consistent as possible so that we can do longitudinal comparisons over the years. There were more changes than normal, I would say, than on our usual scorecard projects in this edition, partially because we wanted to place more emphasis on energy equity. Last edition, we only had 6 percentage points being able to go to energy equity. This year, we went to 22. And as a result of that, and moving points into those areas, we decreased the scoring in other categories, and we renormalized the scores to be out of 100 rather than out of 50. So going back and comparing scores with different methodologies, we sometimes change the tiering of how much utilities we need to say spend or save, for example, in order to earn a number of points in a category. So apples to apples comparisons aren't exactly easy, but looking at Maryland, it looks as if in general some of the savings numbers may have gone down. That's just a quick look based on scores, but I would have to dig into those numbers a little bit deeper to provide more insight into that.
Thank you very much, Mike. A question for Dr. Carly and Chelsea. A questioner asks about the correlation between, a potential correlation, I should say, observing a connection between low energy efficiency scorecard scores in utility jurisdictions in areas that have higher poverty in the country. Do you have any thoughts on anything connecting there? Dr. Carly first.
Sure. I'll just say that this, I think, highlights the immense value of having the scorecard, that it not only provides information where we can rank and look at utilities and then dissect the utilities, dissect the policies, as Chelsea did so beautifully, but we can use those data and overlay those data with other indicators to tell more nuanced stories. So I haven't done that, but I think your intuition might be right. And I think going forward and combining those data and telling that story is really important.
And Chelsea, building on that, there were a number of questions about the weatherization programs that you referenced, who provide services to many of low-income households, as well as the impact of potential withdrawing from RGGI in Virginia.
Yes, I've been answering those questions in the Q&A, and I was trying to get the Q&A to go away. All right, there you go. Yeah, so in Virginia, we are very unique because today we're only talking about our 2 investor-owned utilities, but we actually, in addition, have 8 electric cooperatives that operate in the state. And then we also have Kentucky Utility that operates in only 5 counties in very far Southwest Virginia as Old Dominion Power. And the further south and west that you go, the more rural and impoverished the state is versus Northern Virginia, right outside of the DC metro area, which has actually some of the most expensive, richest counties in the country. So when I talked about APCO and Dominion having almost being 2 different worlds, that's the dichotomy of our state. We go from one of the richest counties in the nation to coal country. And so it's just very vastly different. And unfortunately, yes, I think depending on who your utility is, and perhaps how much of a budget the weatherization provider in your area has, I think that there is a discrepancy or disparity really in the services that you can receive. A lot of Justice 40 communities, particularly in Central and Northern Virginia, particularly those that are urban, they have greater services and greater resources. But then as you move south side and Southwest Virginia, those resources are fewer and far between. Yeah, so there were 2 questions about RGGI and the weatherization program. I touched on RGGI briefly, but RGGI, even though the money comes from our utilities through carbon trading, that money is then managed by our Department of Housing and Community Development for low-income programs. So the energy savings that are achieved through RGGI are not calculated in the utility score because it doesn't count as a utility program. So that is separate money that is managed by Department of Housing and Community Development.
Thank you, Chelsea. We received a number of questions about the particular challenge for renters in this process, and including the split incentive. Dr. Carley, do you have any thoughts on overcoming the split incentive where landlords kind of control what efficiency measures can be installed in many cases, but renters pay the utility bills and have the incentive to invest in energy efficiency?
I think here's an opportunity, frankly, to learn from utilities about which programs they do have in place. So those utilities that do have outreach programs for landlords and how they overcome it, what kinds of incentives they provide, what kinds of negotiations they have there, I think is just really important. But off the top of my head, I don't know of utilities that have particularly progressive policies in this area.
Great.
So one thing that I'll add is, again, looking at the weatherization network, traditionally, and I don't know if this is the same in other states, but traditionally in Virginia, the weatherization providers have used federal weatherization funds just for single family. Some of them do some multifamily, but not a lot. However, they are using the Dominion. So Dominion actually has a regulated program, low income program. And then I mentioned that through the GTSA, they committed to spending $13 million of shareholder funded programs, dollars through their energy share program. And so they have 2 different programs, one that's not regulated by the SCC because the shareholders pay for it, and then the regulated one that goes through the regular process. The weatherization providers use both of those programs to do a lot of multifamily. Those programs actually provide about 90% of those dollars goes to multifamily. So a lot of times the weatherization providers are in contact with the building owner. The building owner may have gotten in touch with them. They might do a cold call. It might have been a tenant that reached out. But we do see some multifamily that is happening here, particularly on the Dominion side. And I also give a plug. With advocacy groups, they're only in certain states, but Energy Efficiency for All, or EFA, is a great coalition of consumer advocates and energy efficiency advocates in certain states that are really hoping to address this particular problem with the split incentive with renters and landlords. We do have an active coalition here in Virginia. I know there's some in other states too, but if you're aware, if your state has one, I would recommend getting in touch with them because they do a really great job of keeping this question to the forefront.
Yep. Thank you so much. We've reached the end of our time. Thank you again to our panelists. Also, we had a question about community-based organizations in impacted communities that participate. I want to give a shout out to our Leading with Equity initiative, who does and has for the last few years convened and supported the participation, and particularly thank all of the community-based organizations who have helped us shape the equity focus of these scorecards through that initiative. I also want to thank again our funders, our staff, the utilities who are leading these programs and responding to our requests. Again, thank you all so much for participating in this launch, in reviewing the scorecard. Please do send us your questions. Feel free to put more in the Q&A. We will try to respond. But with that, thank you all so much. We look forward to future engagement with ACEEE events and with our work. Thank you.